The tweet was meant to go unnoticed. Just another snide remark in the digital sea of political mockery. Dr. Elias Roth, a tenured Georgetown law professor with book deals, primetime commentary slots, and an ego taller than the Washington Monument, tapped it out between bites of his $19 kale salad. Hard to take someone like Lauren Boebert seriously on constitutional issues when she probably thinks the Bill of Rights is a receipt from Cracker Barrel. He smirked to himself, clicked post, and set the phone aside. The reaction was instant. 1,000 likes in 10 minutes, then 10,000, then more. The replies were savage, gleeful, mean-spirited, just the way Twitter liked it. Lauren Boebert saw the tweet while sitting in her truck outside a school gymnasium in Rifle, Colorado, waiting for her son's basketball practice to finish. The engine was off, her hands were cold, and her phone lit up like it had caught fire. She read it once, then twice. The words didn't sting. She was used to mockery. It came with the job. But something about the smugness, the complete certainty in his words, sparked something in her that wasn't anger. It was resolve. She didn't tweet back right away. No one saw her make the decision. No one heard the small, amused exhale from her nose or saw the quiet smile that tugged at her lips. But when she did respond, it was simple. Let's debate, you and me, Georgetown Law Auditorium. You bring your textbooks, I'll bring the Constitution. That one tweet broke the internet. Within hours, her name was trending nationwide. Half of Twitter exploded in laughter, certain this was another stunt. The other half began quietly whispering, "What if she's serious?" Elias Roth wasn't used to being challenged by anyone outside his intellectual circle. He found her tweet amusing, then irritating. But he also smelled opportunity, a chance to publicly humiliate her, live, on stage, with every camera lens focused on him. The invitation went out. Georgetown Law agreed. The auditorium was booked. It would be live-streamed, moderated by the editor-in-chief of a major political magazine. The debate would be framed around federal constitutional authority, particularly executive overreach through the Commerce Clause. The internet sharpened its knives. Cable news booked panels. Legal analysts giggled behind thick glasses. Political TikTokers prepared their memes. Lauren Boebert didn't prepare for war. She prepared for truth. The night of the debate, the line outside the Georgetown Law Center wrapped around the block. Inside, the hall was buzzing with energy, like the air before a thunderstorm. Reporters crammed into corners. Students shuffled into their seats. The front row was lined with congressional staffers, think tank policy wonks, and several professors from rival institutions hoping to see blood. Lauren arrived quietly, slipping through a side door in a black coat and navy slacks. No glam squad, no entourage. Just her and a folder tucked under her arm. Roth, on the other hand, entered with theatrical flair. Blue suit, red tie, polished shoes, and a confident grin made for cameras. He greeted the moderator with a practiced handshake and posed for a few pictures with faculty. The moderator opened the evening with a smile that barely concealed his amusement. Tonight, we explore the constitutional boundaries of executive authority, the limits of the Commerce Clause, and the interpretations that shape our federal structure. Representing the academic view, Dr. Elias Roth, and representing the legislative view, Congresswoman Lauren Boebert. There was polite applause for Lauren, thunderous applause for Roth. He leaned toward his mic and offered a casual smirk. "Thank you. I think it's quite generous of Georgetown to allow this educational outreach program, where members of Congress can learn constitutional law from real scholars." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Lauren didn't flinch. The moderator gave him the floor first. Roth began with the ease of a man who'd made a career out of public speaking. He cited landmark cases, Wickard vs. Philbin, Gonzalez vs. Reich, and used technical jargon peppered with Latin phrases. He referenced obscure clauses, cited papers he'd written, and paced the stage like a TED Talk host on steroids. The audience loved it. When the moderator turned to Lauren, the cameras zoomed in. The room held its breath. The knives were out. She began slowly, calmly, her voice clear and grounded. Dr. Roth made one thing very clear tonight, she said. He's great at reciting what has already been said. I came here to talk about what hasn't. A few eyebrows lifted. You said the Commerce Clause has been tested, clarified and settled. But what you didn't mention, she said, lifting her folder, is the part of the National Emergencies Act that creates a legal backdoor, one that's never been directly reviewed by the Supreme Court, allowing executive overreach through regulatory mandates tied to interstate supply chains. Silence. She went on. Under current law, a president can declare a non-emergency regulatory priority that impacts multiple states, triggering dormant Commerce Clause justification, without congressional approval, if it's funneled through an agency's rulemaking process. And guess what? That authority has never been constitutionally limited. She pulled a printed study from her folder. This is from the Congressional Research Service. Page 27 outlines that ambiguity. Someone from the audience audibly whispered, "Wait, what?" She looked directly at Roth. "You know this document. You helped review it." He blinked, shifted in his seat. "And while you were making Twitter jokes," she said, voice rising just slightly, "I was writing legislation to close that loophole. House Resolution 3541. It's been submitted, and the cert petition is on its way to the Supreme Court." A collective inhale swept across the room. Lauren continued, her eyes never leaving Roth. "You said I probably think the Bill of Rights is a Cracker Barrel receipt. But I'm the one who just found a constitutional gap that your department missed. Or ignored. And now, the highest court in the land will decide." The room went from tense to electric. Reporters scrambled. Phones lit up. Students leaned forward. Roth opened his mouth but said nothing. The moderator turned to him, stunned. "Dr. Roth? Response?" He stumbled over a few words, trying to recover. He questioned her interpretation. He tried to pivot to legal theory, but the damage was done. His smugness had turned to sputtering. Lauren stood firm, poised, composed. The underestimated woman who had walked into the lion's den with nothing but a folder and left with the truth. The applause was slow to start. Then it grew. Some students rose, not many, but enough. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The video of the debate was uploaded before midnight. Within 24 hours, it had more views than any previous Georgetown debate in history. Headlines flooded in. Lauren Boebert Schools, Georgetown law professor, live on stage. The night the internet got it wrong about Lauren Boebert. Page 27. The clause no one noticed, except her. She didn't do interviews afterward. She didn't need a victory lap. She flew home to Colorado, walked into her house just before sunrise, made herself a cup of coffee, and sat quietly with her dog curled at her feet. She knew what was coming, the media storm, the backlash, the smug apologies disguised as clarifications. But she also knew this wasn't about clapping back. It was about reshaping how people saw her. Not as a soundbite, but as a strategist, a fighter, and a woman with more grit than her critics ever imagined. And this time, there was no laugh track. Just respect. Lauren sat in the quiet of her kitchen. the warmth of the mug in her hands grounding her more than any round of applause ever had. The sun hadn't yet breached the horizon. Outside, the Colorado winter had laid its hush over the town, the world momentarily silent, unaware that a storm had already begun to swirl across the internet. Her phone buzzed relentlessly on the counter, vibrating with mentions, missed calls, and texts from numbers she hadn't seen since her first run for Congress. She didn't reach for it. Not yet. The silence in her chest was something she wanted to hold on to a little longer. It was the sound of knowing she had shifted something real, something bigger than applause, bigger than headlines. By mid-morning, the media had exploded. CNN ran a segment titled Boebert and the Commerce Clause, a rare moment of constitutional precision. MSNBC tried to spin it, softening Roth's meltdown as a deliberate pause for dialogue. But the footage told the truth. Clip after clip flooded Twitter, X, Instagram, TikTok. The moment when she said, "You helped review it," had become a viral punchline. People stitched videos of Roth's reaction with everything from shocked anime faces to NBA crowd reactions. Even late-night comedy had trouble spinning it. Stephen Colbert opened his monologue with a deep sigh. "Okay, folks, Lauren Boebert actually made a valid constitutional argument last night." The audience laughed, unsure if it was a bit. "No, seriously. She cited page 27, I checked." Behind closed doors, the phones at the White House counsel's office lit up. Policy staffers at multiple federal agencies began reviewing the language Lauren had cited. Quiet emails were exchanged, and for the first time in years, the Department of Justice started reviewing the structural implications of the dormant Commerce Clause. Lauren stayed quiet. She issued no statement. She tweeted no follow-ups. She let the silence speak, but not everyone stayed quiet. Dr. Roth, humiliated, took to a podcast interview 2 days later. His voice was sharp, bitter. "This isn't about being outsmarted," he snapped. "It's about political theatre." She made a splash. Good for her. But constitutional law isn't a game. The host, clearly trying to throw him a lifeline, asked, "But was she factually correct?" There was a long pause. "Yes," he said finally. "She was." That clip made its rounds too. Meanwhile, inside the Capitol, Lauren returned to her office to find a stack of handwritten letters, some supportive, others stunned, but most of them beginning the same way. "I didn't expect to write you." A senior staffer from the Judiciary Committee stopped by her office later that week. "I read the CRS study," he said. "Page 27. You're right. That language is sloppy. Dangerous even." Lauren nodded. "I didn't highlight it for attention. I highlighted it because someone needed to." He hesitated, then added, "You're being invited to the Federalist Society's National Symposium next month. They want you on the Constitutional Review panel." She blinked. "You're joking." "No," he said, smiling awkwardly. "They've never invited a sitting member of Congress who doesn't have a law degree. Until now." That night, she sat in her office long after the sun had disappeared. The Capitol was nearly empty. Staffers gone. The air felt heavy with a new kind of tension, the kind that comes when the winds start to change. She stared out her window, the lights of DC twinkling like distant stars. Her reflection in the glass was clearer than it had been in months. For years, people had tried to make her into a caricature, loud, reckless, unthinking. They clipped her words, twisted her intent, erased her work, and amplified her stumbles. But they had missed the one thing she never stopped doing, learning. And now they were watching her differently. She could feel it. A week later, Roth resigned from his television contract. Georgetown's faculty quietly shuffled him into research-only status for the semester. There was no public statement, just absence. Lauren received an email from a young law student, someone who had sat in the front row that night. The subject line simply read, "Page 27, change my major." Inside was a message that made her pause. "I came to the debate expecting to laugh. I left wanting to understand. I'm transferring into constitutional studies this fall. Thank you for reminding me that truth doesn't wear a tie." She saved it. Didn't respond. Just saved it. Because some victories didn't need to be posted. They needed to be protected. She began building a new proposal, a bipartisan task force to review federal regulatory overreach and reform the language in the National Emergencies Act. Her staff was hesitant. "They're not going to support something with your name on it." "Then we'll put someone else's name on it," she said simply. "I don't need credit. I need it to pass." By spring, the task force had enough quiet support to move forward. Policy writers began whispering her name in think tank hallways. Constitutional scholars began citing her debate in university courses. And somewhere in a small, overheated committee room, a bill began to form that might one day limit the unchecked power of presidents from both parties. Not because a professor found the flaw, but because a woman they all underestimated walked into their world with a folder, a voice, and the unshakable belief that truth still mattered. She didn't change who she was. She changed how they saw her. And that, she knew, was the most dangerous thing of all. The halls of Congress echoed with a strange kind of quiet the morning after the debate. Not silence, never silence, but something more restrained, controlled, as if even the walls were uncertain of what came next. People glanced at Lauren differently now. Staffers from across the aisle offered polite nods they never would have considered a week earlier. A young Democrat from Vermont passed her in the corridor and muttered, "Good hit, by the way," before disappearing behind a closed door. Inside her office, the television played quietly in the background. Panel after panel dissected the debate, shifting from amusement to genuine analysis. Her name wasn't being laughed off anymore. It was being considered, studied, and more importantly, feared. The phone rang. She let it ring twice before picking up. A familiar voice met her ear. Congressman Ray Durham, a Republican veteran with 3 decades of Beltway survival behind him. "You know what you just did, right?" he said without greeting. Lauren leaned back in her chair. "You mean the part where I didn't get embarrassed on national TV?" He chuckled. The part where you made law schools take you seriously. That's the dangerous part." She said nothing, letting the silence hang. "You rattled the cage," he continued, "and people are waking up inside it. You're going to start hearing from folks who usually don't pick up the phone for anyone outside Harvard or Yale." He wasn't wrong. That week, invitations flooded in. Panel discussions, interviews, symposiums, even a quiet request from a federal judge to grab coffee and talk constitutional language. Lauren declined most of them. Not because she wasn't interested, but because she knew how fast the narrative could twist. The minute she turned the moment into a tour, they'd call it vanity, opportunism. So she did the unexpected. She kept working. In back rooms and over long nights, she and a small team of legal aides began dissecting the language of the National Emergencies Act. They built a matrix, identifying every executive order tied to commerce justification that bypassed Congress. The results were staggering. 87 orders, across 5 administrations, some well-meaning, others terrifying in their reach. They compiled a confidential white paper, 56 pages, titled simply, Commerce Clause, Subversion, an Institutional Blind Spot. She mailed it, without ceremony, to every constitutional law professor who had publicly criticised her. Some responded with silence, others with private notes of respect. One, a professor from Stanford, called her office directly and left a voicemail. "You were right. I wasn't looking. That's on me." The shift was slow, but it was real. Not everyone celebrated it. The knives were still out, now sharper, more subtle. One morning, her staffer, Marlene, stepped into her office with a pale face and a trembling stack of papers. "You're going to want to see this," she said, placing the documents on Lauren's desk. It was a leaked opposition research file from her own party. Pages of quotes, past missteps, social media flubs, even an old arrest record resurfaced with fresh, exaggerated footnotes. It was a political kill order, not designed to wound, but to erase. Lauren didn't blink. "They're scared," she said simply. Marlene hesitated. "What do you want to do?" Lauren stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the Capitol dome rising in the distance. "I want to write something they can't ignore." That night, she drafted a new proposal. Not a speech, not a thread, but a full-blown policy manifesto. 15 pages, no fluff, no slogans, just language rooted in originalist interpretation, reinforced with bipartisan case examples. She titled it, The Restraint Doctrine, a modern framework for limiting executive economic reach. When it hit political forums online, the reaction was instantaneous. Academics debated it. Law students highlighted it. Think tanks scrambled to respond. Suddenly, the caricature of Lauren Boebert wasn't holding. She was reshaping, and that made her enemies furious. At the DOJ, quiet meetings began. People whispered her name like it was a problem to be solved. "She's not supposed to know this stuff. She's not supposed to write like that. Who's behind her?" But there was no one behind her, just long nights, quiet research, and a stubborn refusal to be underestimated. One morning, as she prepared for a closed-door hearing on federal economic controls, a staffer handed her a letter with no return address. Inside, a single sentence typed in courier font. "They won't come for your policies. They'll come for your past." She folded the paper, placed it in a drawer, and locked it. 3 days later, a story dropped in a DC political blog, dredging up an old personal matter, twisted for maximum embarrassment. The timing wasn't coincidental. It never was. She didn't respond publicly. Instead, she walked into that hearing, sat across from 6 skeptical Democrats, and calmly outlined how their own party had used the same Commerce Clause loophole under Obama, then again under Biden, citing page numbers, dates, and financial impacts line by line. She didn't yell, didn't accuse. She just laid the truth on the table like a surgeon presenting a scalpel. When it was over, 2 members crossed the aisle and shook her hand. Outside, the cameras waited, hoping for fireworks. She gave them silence, because now she understood the game in full. It wasn't about sound bites. It was about momentum. She didn't want to win Twitter. She wanted to win history. That night, Roth returned to television. His face was drawn, older somehow, humbled, but not broken. "I underestimated her," he said. "We all did. And maybe that's the lesson we needed most." The clip went viral. People stopped laughing and started listening. She'd walked into the lion's den with nothing but her voice and the Constitution. And now the lions were whispering her name. He was no longer an underdog. That much was clear. The invitations didn't stop. A quiet dinner with a Supreme Court Justice's clerk. A panel seat at the Montpellier summit. A cryptic voicemail from a presidential advisor simply saying, "We should talk." But Lauren had learned. Noise doesn't always mean opportunity. Often, it meant a leash. She turned most of them down, answering only the invitations that let her keep doing the thing no one expected. Thinking, writing, learning, changing the map from the inside out. The moment that crystallized it all didn't come on a debate stage or in a Fox News chyron. It came on a rainy Tuesday in a small congressional subcommittee meeting that barely anyone paid attention to. Room 4, 32-B. Cold, fluorescent, forgettable. The chair opened the floor to miscellaneous matters. No cameras, no reporters, just policy analysts and tired interns. Lauren asked to speak. She took the mic, unfolded her latest proposal, and began explaining in detail how the language in the 2001 Commerce Revision Act conflicted with post-9/11 procurement protocols under Homeland guidelines. It was dry, painfully so, but it mattered. She wasn't performing, she wasn't trending, she was leading. One by one, staffers began texting their bosses. "She's in control of this room." Even her rivals didn't interrupt. They listened. Some even nodded. After the session, a Democratic staffer caught her in the hallway. "I didn't vote for you," he said. "I campaigned against you." But that was the cleanest policy explanation I've ever heard from this building. She thanked him and walked away. Outside, the rain hadn't let up. Her driver offered an umbrella. She waved him off and walked the 3 blocks to her apartment. Let the storm hit her face. Let the world be wet and real and unedited. At home, she found the letter waiting. A heavy envelope, real ink. The seal of the Federal Bar Association embossed on the back. Inside, an honorary invitation to keynote their annual convention. No politician had ever been asked before. She sat down at the kitchen table, the weight of the moment settling slowly. She wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. Instead, she did neither. She opened her laptop, pulled up a blank document, and typed a new title. The Forgotten Voice. Constitutional Interpretation Outside the Ivory Tower. It would be her next article, peer-reviewed, fact-checked, submitted for publication in the very journal that once dismissed her as unserious. No fire, no fury, just clarity. 2 days later, the backlash came. An anonymous op-ed hit a major outlet. Boebert's rebrand is a dangerous mirage. It accused her of playing a long game, of masking extremism with intellect. She didn't respond. Instead, she sent a handwritten letter to the op-ed's author, a progressive law professor who'd called her a performance artist in MAGA makeup. It read, "I don't need you to believe me. I need you to check my sources. If I'm wrong, write it. If I'm right, say that too." That's the deal we all signed up for. L. 3 weeks later, the professor wrote a follow-up. "I reviewed her work. She's right." It was the smallest paragraph in the longest piece, but it cracked something open, and the world noticed. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court formally accepted her cert petition. The page 27 clause, once a footnote in a dusty report, was now a scheduled argument before the highest court in the country. The case was officially listed as Boebert v. United States. She didn't smile at the news. She breathed. She breathed like someone who had carried truth too long and finally found a place to put it down. In a private moment that night, she called her father. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice gravelly. "They're talking about you, kid," he said. "I know," she replied softly. "Good or bad?" "Both," he chuckled. "Means you're doing something real." She leaned against her window, watching the city lights blur through the glass. "I don't want to be famous," she said. "I want to matter." "You already do." The call ended. She stayed at the window a while longer. At dawn, she woke with a sentence ringing in her head. Truth doesn't need a podium. It just needs someone who won't look away. She wrote it down and taped it to her fridge. Weeks passed. The country moved on to new scandals, new elections, new headlines. But the people who mattered were still watching. The clerks, the staffers, the writers, the students, the old men in law libraries who never tweeted but still understood the weight of words. One day, a young woman approached her at Reagan National Airport. She looked no older than 20, nervous, hopeful, holding a battered paperback of the Constitution. "I saw your debate," she said, barely above a whisper. "You made me change my major." Lauren smiled. "I hope I made you think," she replied. "Changing's up to you." That was the moment she knew. Not that she had won, but that she had started something. Not a trend, a ripple. A small, stubborn push against a system too long controlled by gatekeepers who mistook degrees for wisdom and noise for depth. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not in the law journals, not in the court filings, not in the minds of the very people who once mocked her. But she was. And now they couldn't unsee her. She had walked into their world with nothing but her name and the Constitution, and left with both rewritten. Not with fire, but with focus. Not with anger, but with accuracy. Not to be liked, but to be remembered. And she would be. Not because she was loud, but because she had listened. And then, when it mattered most, she spoke.